So Ramin, no, this is Ramin. I think you are further down, and I'm at the end of the line. Shadi, you are here. No, okay. We got it. Here, unless you personally have a strong feeling, I leave you up to you to choose.
Good afternoon. I'm delighted to welcome you to today's event, 5 years in, the legacy of the Arab Spring. I'm Henri Baki. I think I'm the director of the Middle East program. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to all the members of the Wilson Center Board of Trustees. Those of you who don't know that we had a Board of Trustees meeting here today. The Wilson National Cabinet, the Wilson Center Advisory Council, the Wilson Center Corporate Council, and the Women in Public Service Project Advisory Board. We are joined by, he's not here though, by Tom Niles, who's the chairman of the Wilson Center Board of Trustees, Ambassador Mrs. Gildenhorn. I see Ambassador Gildenhorn. Oh, she's in the back. Okay. And also the ambassador of Iraq is supposed to be here. He actually usually sits where Hamid sits. He thinks he owns that spot, but maybe that's why he's not here. I would like to thank several people for their help in making today's event possible. First, I'd like to thank Honorable Jane Harmon, the Director and the President and CEO of the Wilson Center, as all you know, and for her interest and attention to the MENA region and her for support for the Middle East program. I also would like to thank Hamid, who's our National Security Fellow, and it was really his idea to have this meeting on 5 years after the beginning of the Arab Spring. And so he actually conceived a great deal of the panels today. And also would like to recognize Roger Mark D'Souza and Lauren Herzer of the Wilson Center's Environmental Change and Security Program, who really made a great contribution to the second panel of today. And we have two panels, as you know, from the program. The first is on the makeup of the post-Arab Spring politics, where we will explore the notable effects of the Arab Spring on political governance, on politics and governance issues, and the panelists will differentiate between developments that are passing phenomena and those that will have a lasting impact on the region's political fabric. And to moderate the panel today, we have Marina Ottaway, who's a Middle East fellow and a great contributor to the Middle East program here. One of the more prolific, actually the most prolific participant probably of the Middle East program. And she will conduct and run the first panel, and I will run the second panel, which is on the physical destruction and the prospects for reconstruction, and where we will analyze the physical toll incurred by 5+ years of violent turmoil. I will say more when it's my turn to introduce the second panel, but Marina, it's your show. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and good afternoon to everybody. I hope that not too many of you went to the lunch, which was very good and very large and probably very soporific as a result. So I hope that you'll be, at least those of you who ate more sparingly will be able to stay awake. We have a very good panel. We have a very interesting topic, of course. We are talking about the post-Arab Spring political situation, which certainly has been topic of endless discussion and will continue to be a topic of endless discussion, because this is not an issue that's going to go away. We have 4 distinguished panelists that they all have very long and complex bios. I'm just going to give you a few of the major points because I think you have, I hope you have the bios, and if not, they are out there. To my left is going Shadi Hamid, who is also going to be the first speaker, and he's going to talk about social compacts or lack thereof. I don't quite know how he's going to focus on this in the post-Arab Spring period. He's a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution Center for Middle East Policy and the author of several books, including a forthcoming Islamic Exceptionalism, How the Struggle Over Islam is Reshaping the New Middle East, which I'm very much looking forward to reading when it's out. He is one of the founding members of the Project on Middle East Democracy before he left for Brookings, first at the Doha Center and now in Washington. The second speaker is Amy Hawthorne, who, and you'll find that as I go on with the introductions, that the word of of Middle East specialist in Washington, it's a game of musical chairs. Because Amy Hawthorne is now the deputy director for research at the Project for Middle East Democracy, which is where Shadi was in the past. She went to POMED from the Atlantic Council, where she was part of the researchers, the group at the Rafiq Hariri Center on the Middle East. And before that, she was at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where I was before I came here and where Paul was before he went to the Middle East Council. So there is kind of a game of musical chairs here. Robin Wright. She's such a Washington fixture that I don't have to say very much about her. If you go and listen to talks, probably you have heard her speaking recently. She's a journalist, she's an author, she's a prolific author and prolific speaker, if you use prolific for a speaker. She's associated both with the United States Institute of Peace and with the Woodrow Wilson Center, author of numerous books particularly on Iran. And finally, at the end of the line there is Paul Salem, who is Vice President for Policy and Research at the Middle East Institute. He was, before going to the Middle East Institute, he was at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where he essentially opened up the Middle East Center of the Carnegie Endowment in Beirut. And I must say we worked quite closely together on that project for a few years. And before that, he was at various other institutions in Beirut. He had taught in American University at different times. Okay, I'm not going to give you many more details on this. I'll turn it over to Shadi to talk about social compacts.
Great. Thanks so much, Marina. Good to be here. So, when I was thinking about what I was going to say to you all today, I was debating about, how pessimistic should I be? So we'll see. But I guess I'll have to be pretty pessimistic considering where we're at now. Well, let me just start off with some kind of broad headlines in terms of how we can frame the Arab Spring 5 years later. The first thing I would say is that one of the unfortunate lessons is that violence works. And it's sad because this is the opposite of what we hoped the Arab Spring would be about, right? The idea that peaceful protest and democracy could actually change things in the region. And violence works not just when it comes to extremist groups like ISIS, but also with resurgent autocratic regimes that, instead of rethinking their social compact, many of them have doubled down on repression. The most obvious case here is the case of Egypt. That's violence. Now, another lesson, also a pessimistic one, is that fear as a motivator is more powerful than we thought. And, all of you probably recall when we used to say things, nice, naive things like, the wall of fear has been broken, and things like that. Well, it was briefly, but the wall of fear has been rebuilt, and I would say that it's not 100% solid, but in some ways it's stronger than it was before, at least in some countries, I would say. Now, those are two kind of overarching frames. Now, part of why I wanted to start with that is, for me, one of the formative moments as a researcher over the past few years was my experience in Egypt 2 days. So I left Egypt 2 days before the Rabaa massacre happened. And it's an odd thing to wait for a massacre. So for me, this was sort of the bookend of the Arab Spring. And I was also in Egypt in Tahrir Square the day Mubarak fell. So for me, that was kind of a rise and fall, and it captures it quite well, the depressing nature of what we saw. But, waiting for a massacre and then seeing how people sort of fall back on bloodlust, including, I should say, people who are very dear to me. So I'm born and raised here in the U.S., but my relatives are Egyptian, and many of my relatives very enthusiastically supported mass killings of their fellow countrymen. So that, again, forces you to move in this more pessimistic direction, shall we say. Now moving on, I want to kind of talk a little bit more about this idea of a social compact, but the broader concept, which I think is important. Oh, okay. The broader concept, which I think is really important, is this question of legitimacy, which I think all of us will be talking about to one extent or another. And, it's a bit of a cliche to say, well, we have to understand the past to understand the future, but that's precisely what I'll do now. And let me go a little bit back, and for me, the date of 1924 has become more important for me as I try to understand what's going on almost a century later. And as many of you will know, 1924, I know some of you are probably trying to think what happened then, but 1924 was the formal abolition of the last caliphate, the Ottoman Caliphate. And ever since then, really, there has been a legitimacy deficit in the Middle East. So the absence of a caliphate or the caliphate has led to a kind of perpetually untenable situation where people can disagree on very basic things regarding the nation state. And it's not just, and it's deeper and almost metaphysical in a sense, because people can't agree on the meaning, the purpose, and the very nature of the nation state. And one of the issues which divides people, of course, is the question of the role of religion in public life. So for me, when I try to understand, say, the rise of ISIS, obviously the rise of ISIS is very much tied to events that have happened over the past 10 to 15 years, certainly the Iraq War, and I would argue also our failure to intervene more decisively in Syria. Those are two very important factors, but I think that we also have to see the rise of ISIS as part of a broader problem which has really been ongoing for a much longer period of time, that ISIS itself has a particular answer to this unresolved question of the relationship between religion and state in the modern Middle East. And really, if we want to even go back further in time, from the 7th century until 1924, there was a continuous political lineage of not just a caliphate, it could also have been competing caliphates, but the point there is that you have a political structure, a legal structure, an overarching moral disposition, let's say, where the role of Islam is accepted and legitimate, and that's what you have for a very long period of time until the modern era, where it becomes contested in a way between, to oversimplify it a bit, but between Islamists and secularists and liberals and anti-Islamists and so on and so forth. Now, I'll just say a couple words about ISIS and how ISIS fits into how we try to understand legitimacy in the social compact. And we talk a lot about the tactical issues when it comes to ISIS, that have they lost this amount of territory, are they gaining, that sort of thing. That's actually not very interesting to me, and I think that it's sort of a problem that we're so focused on, I think, these rather narrow questions. For me, the more interesting question isn't what ISIS is or what it does, but rather what it means as a concept, as an idea. And what ISIS means, and I think that even if ISIS was destroyed tomorrow, the legacy of ISIS would really be with us for the rest of our lives. I don't think the damage can really be undone, because before ISIS, the caliphate, or a caliphate in quotation marks, was an inspiration and aspiration, but it wasn't actually real. No one wanted to mess with something as weighty as that. Al-Qaeda never actually got that serious about it. And here, I think ISIS distinguishes itself. So it's not about the marketing that has to do with the idea of a caliphate, but also the unusually pronounced interest in governance. ISIS has spent a lot of time thinking about how it wants to govern and offering, I would argue, a distinctive model of governance that is rather is worth looking at more closely. And here I would take issue with the narrative that ISIS just makes things up as they go along. I think that it's actually more coherent than we might like to admit. And what we see, I think, are fairly intricate and in some ways elaborate institutional structures. We have any number of, we have interlocking Sharia courts. It's a rather sophisticated court system. We have detailed tax codes. It's also bureaucratically quite interesting if you look at the different administrative departments in various provinces. Now, since I don't have a lot more time, I'll just say the best article on how ISIS governs, a little verbal footnote, if you will, is Andrew March and Mara Revkin's article in Foreign Affairs called The Caliphate of Law. But what they argue is that ISIS's approach is defined by quote-unquote scrupulous legality. So there's a kind of rule-based order. It doesn't mean they're necessarily great at governing, but if you're comparing between absolute chaos or terrible governance or the total lack of a rule-based order, for people who might otherwise detest ISIS's ideology, they might still kind of live with it or come to terms with it because it's better than the alternative. And I think this is important because before ISIS changed how we talk about these issues, it was actually, and, Robin and others might touch on this as well, but before ISIS, you had mainstream Islamist groups like the Muslim Brotherhood who argued that they were the ones who would be most prepared to govern if they were given the opportunity. And this is the argument they had in the mid-2000s against groups like Al-Qaeda, saying, okay, Al-Qaeda can destroy quite well and blow things up, but we're the ones, the mainstream Islamists, who will actually be able to offer an alternative, again, if we're given the chance. Well, of course, they were, at least in some countries, given the chance, and now it's much more difficult for them to make that particular argument that they are the practical governors. Or the ones who are naturally best equipped to actually get things done. And it goes a little bit deeper than that because the very premise of mainstream Islamism is itself a sort of tactical accommodation with modernity. So if I had to sum up, the Brotherhood's project in one sentence, it would be an attempt to reconcile pre-modern Islamic law with the modern nation state. So it's inherently accommodationist. That hasn't worked out so well either. And I will just end on this kind of thought that what we're seeing now is a broader rethinking of the state, the modern nation state. We hear a lot about that. But the fact now that Islamists, the mainstream ones at least, have spent the last couple decades coming to terms with a lot of these trappings. So it's not just the nation state, but also the things we associate with the nation state: democracy, elections, forming political parties, trying to win political power and then govern a centralized state. That was how they were looking at things in a number of countries. That basic premise is now coming under attack. Is that the best way to pursue political change? But it's not just Islamists who have come to think this way. What we see throughout the region, I think, or what we have seen in the region up until quite recently, was an almost cultural obsession with the state as the engine of societal change. And I think now we're really going to have to question that, certainly as analysts and observers, but the people in the region as well, and the parties and movements that are contesting political power. Thanks.
Hey, thank you very much, Shadi. You can continue the discussion on legitimacy, I guess.
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks very much to the Wilson Center for inviting me. Can everyone hear me okay? I've been asked to say a few words about the issue of political legitimacy as it relates to the Arab uprisings of 5 years ago and what's happening in the region today. And I would argue that a crisis of political legitimacy is at the heart of what is raging throughout the Middle East and North Africa now, tearing parts of the region apart and causing severe strain in others, and that this issue of political legitimacy is a core contested issue. What is the relationship between governments or leaders and their citizens? What should and can citizens expect from their governments? What is the governing system under which Arabs and citizens of these different countries can live? And what gives rulers the right to rule? The 2011 uprisings, I believe, were about many, many things, and I think that we still don't fully understand what they were about completely. But I think that this issue of a crisis of political legitimacy and a rejection by many, not all certainly, but by sizable numbers of people in these countries of the prevailing system of legitimacy, or a dissatisfaction with how it was working in practice, was very much at the heart of what happened and what is continuing to roil the region. Now, how do we understand this issue a little bit more fully? It's not a new issue. It has been a struggle in the region for a very long time. And almost 30 years ago, the very important scholar, political scientist Michael Hudson wrote an entire book on this issue in 1977. And he described the crisis of political legitimacy as the single greatest crisis facing the Arab world. This was in 1977. And he defined it saying that the central problem of government in the Arab world is the problem of legitimacy. Do citizens regard as proper and deserving of support their rulers, and more than their rulers, the governing systems through which they work? The extent to which leadership and regimes are perceived by both elites and masses as compatible with society's fundamental myths and values, and can these leaders and the governing system protect their broadest concerns, at least with a significant majority of the people residing in a country? We know that since 1977, this issue has been very much shaping Arab politics and the trajectory in the Arab world. We've seen this in I think Islamist movements have a lot to do with this issue. Before 2011, we saw several sort of precursors to the Arab uprisings. There was the whole invasion and situation in Iraq. So this isn't something new, but in a few months, in the beginning of 2011, it burst above the surface and became a very, very intense, galvanizing issue. Now, political legitimacy is not the same thing as democratic legitimacy. I would argue, and I think several of my co-panelists would agree, that democratic legitimacy is usually the most stable system of political legitimacy in a country. But we've seen by the longevity and staying power of a lot of these Arab regimes, even after these uprisings, that authoritarian regimes can have legitimacy as well. And many of the regimes in the region do, at least to a certain extent. From the 1950s on, I would say that there were a number of features that Arab regimes built their legitimacy upon and drew on this for many decades. For many regimes, it was their post-colonial identity, the fact that they had secured independence from colonial leaders, countries or governing systems or leaders that led nation building and brought social progress, and very significant for a few decades in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, there was very significant economic and educational and social progress in Arab countries. And this was a real source of legitimacy for these authoritarian Arab leaders. Stability, the promise of bringing stability is another feature of the authoritarian legitimacy narrative. And of course, the social contract, the idea that, the state will give you certain things in return if you're a citizen. It might give you a job, it might give you subsidized products, it might give you other benefits, it might in some cases give you security in return for your giving up rights and democratic demands. So this has been very shaky and under strain for a long time. But in 2011, for a variety of reasons, this dissatisfaction or unhappiness with the political legitimacy of many regimes burst forth through these mass demonstrations. What have the last 5 years shown us about these issues? Well, we know that Arab regimes, objectively, almost all of them have failed in delivering to their populations the things that I listed previously. At least in recent years, they have not been able to meet these conditions. So they may not be considered legitimate in that way. But we've also seen that there has been no clear alternative to that system put forward that a majority of publics will accept. We've seen some alternatives that had a brief lifespan in some countries. I would argue that ISIS is an alternative actually to this, but in terms of something that could attract majority support and form the basis of new systems of governance, we haven't seen it. So we've seen across the region either the breakdown of the system of legitimacy with nothing clear to replace it, or we've seen sort of putting Band-Aids on the current system and trying to continue it as it limps and struggles along, as we see in Egypt. Shadi mentioned the state. I think Arab citizens, many, are still, the debate about political legitimacy in the Arab world is not about getting rid of the state or replacing it. It's about sort of what its proper role is and how it can provide for what citizens want. So it's very much revolves around the state. The counter-narrative to the democratic legitimacy narrative that was put forward by many demonstrators and protesters during the Arab Spring is that legitimacy should be based more than on democracy, based on the ability of regimes and leaders to provide protection and security to their citizens. And as we've seen certain parts of the region unravel completely, Syria, Libya, Yemen, the ongoing conflict and violence in Iraq, this narrative to many citizens becomes very, very appealing. We've seen also in the last 5 years that conflict management and negotiation as a way to form a new social contract, a new political system, a new system of legitimacy have utterly failed in all cases but Tunisia, which I also think is quite shaky itself. And violence and repression, along with co-optation, have been the main ways to fight out and to contest this struggle over political legitimacy. Institutions have failed. Elections, in many cases, have failed. Either, in the post-Arab Spring context, they've continued to be manipulated, not genuine expressions of popular will, or when they have been free and fair and genuine expressions of popular will, as we saw in Egypt, they've been overturned, often with the support of many, many citizens of the country. So elections as a mechanism for producing and generating and testing legitimacy have failed. The three main forms of legitimacy that we see across the Middle East and North Africa at this point are authoritarian state legitimacy, which, as I said, is very much based around a security narrative. We will protect you. We will keep you secure from ISIS, from the Syrian civil war, from all these problems that are raging, if you agree to accept us in power indefinitely with very little accountability and subsuming your rights. We also see ISIS as a very new and powerful, to some people, example of political legitimacy that is an extreme religious version of political legitimacy. I put that in quotes. That is utopian and purist and relies on extreme violence to enforce itself. Who can imagine ISIS being ISIS without the violence and coercion that it uses? And finally, we see Tunisia as one shaky, nascent, new example of democratic legitimacy that so far is failing to deliver prosperity, economic benefits, and in some cases security to its citizens. So that's a very, very shaky example. So what does all this mean for the future of Arab politics, and what will be the basis of political legitimacy going forward? I don't know. I thought about this a lot when preparing these remarks, and I don't know. I just have a number of questions maybe to leave you with. The first is, or thoughts. The first is that I think the middle class, to the extent which it exists in different forms and different sizes across the Arab world, is actually a very crucial constituency for defining what political legitimacy, what governance system will be in place, what basis will rulers be able to lead. The middle class has been very beneficiary of these past state systems, but also a victim of them. And where educated middle class, not the wealthy elite, but the middle class, where they fall and what kind of system they want, I think will be very, very important. Those who want democratic legitimacy as the basis for governance, in my view, have the right vision, but they're very weak, and they have yet to make their case fully to their compatriots that this system, that democratization and democratic systems will bring security, stability, and prosperity. So it is a hypothesis that has appealed to some people, but as many people, at least people I know in the region, look around and they see how democratization has unfolded in the past 5 years in different countries, they feel worried and nervous, and they don't necessarily see it as a very compelling alternative. So this is a big challenge. With authoritarian regimes who are pursuing this security legitimacy bargain, I believe that they're living on borrowed time. They're running out of resources. They don't have the appropriate policies or cash or ideas to be able to produce jobs, produce security, produce prosperity, produce fully empowered citizens. And what they've done is they've managed to paper over some of these problems and challenges, in many cases using a lot of money and also violence, but they don't really have the answer. I think they're living on borrowed time. And I think that right now where we are in the region is we're in an interlude between the 2011 uprisings and the next wave of change. We're in an interregnum, an interlude period. And what comes next, what form of these three legitimacy, versions of legitimacy will appeal to people and will really capture people's imagination, it's hard to say. Two final things that I'm thinking about a lot as I ponder this question. One is gradual reform. We saw in the 1990s and the 2000s that Arab regimes, in order actually to maintain themselves in power, carried out very limited political liberalization. And the argument that they made, which was very compelling to people in Washington, was this is the way to gradually open up this system. We just want to gradually give people more rights and have a very slow process of political opening. As we shrink services, we reduce what we're giving to citizens, we will give people a little more right to politically participate, but it has to be gradual. That didn't work. 2011 showed that that failed. So what is the alternative model? Can these regimes actually pursue a more genuine and meaningful process of gradual reform, which is always preferable to state collapse? It's always preferable to chaos. Are these leaders capable of it? And finally, what about in the conflict countries? What about in Syria, in Libya, in Yemen? Those wars will eventually come to an end. And what system will be put in place that will allow people in those countries to live together again, and that won't just plant the seeds of future conflict that will plague the region for the next decade? So those are my thoughts, and I will leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. Plenty of food for thought, Amy. More food for thought from you?
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm honored to be with such a distinguished panel. I'm tempted to pick up where Amy left off with an anecdote before I tackle my subject, and that is to talk about Tunisia, which I was a presidential international monitor for the presidential election just over a year ago. And I was really struck by the fact that this was the most pristine election ever held in the Arab world. That Tunisia has a model constitution that enshrines gender equality, that defines human rights, and that involved a very thoughtful and belabored process in writing. It factors in Islamist element, it factors in secular concerns as well as labor issues. People turned out, in cold schoolrooms to vote. And yet, when it came to the tally, it was three things were striking. This is a country that we all count on to be the hope of the Arab Spring. And yet only 32% of the population turned out to vote. The sector of society that voted the least were the young, the very people who had led the uprising. And the lowest single turnout across the country was in Sidi Bouzid, the town where a young fruit vendor named Mohammed Bouazizi set himself on fire and literally ignited the Arab Spring. That when it comes to this issue of political legitimacy, if Tunisia can't deliver with all it's gone through, you really have to wonder if there's anything out there that's going to work. And on Shadi's point of social compacts, the one social compact that has prevailed in an autocratic form is Saudi Arabia. And yet the thing that strikes me so much today is how much we underrate the instability in Saudi Arabia, not just because of the political transition over the past year, but because this is an oil-rich country where somewhere between 33 and 38% of the young people are unemployed. This is unsustainable, where its resources to sustain that social compact can't be perpetuated because of the declining price of oil, because of the whole range of economic factors. And so you have these two extremes. You have autocratic monarchy in Saudi Arabia and a model democracy in Arab terms or Middle East terms in Tunisia, and neither one of them has sustainability or at least faces huge problems. So, sorry, that was off topic, but I couldn't resist. Now, to deal with the issue of sectarianism, I think we lump a lot of different issues under the rubric of sectarianism. I actually think it means a lot of very different things. Yes, there is deep sectarian divide, arguably among the deepest divides we've had in the 14 centuries of Islam. And we see it play out in a lot of different ways. I actually argue that it's not age-old. I think there are a lot of communities that in the 20th century actually not only learned to live together, but intermarried. There was a mixing of cultures and a coexistence in some places, places that today that's not true. The divide we see play out visibly in the tensions between Saudi Arabia, the guardian of Islam's holy places, and Iran, the world's largest Shiite population. It also plays out within countries, within the wars in Syria and Iraq and Yemen, and the domestic tensions in places like Bahrain, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia. We see it visibly in the violence, the attacks that take place, whether it's Sunni extremists targeting Shiite mosques in Iraq, or whether it's Shiite militias engaging in the cleansing of Sunnis. And we see clerics on both sides with the kind of apocalyptic rhetoric that's prevailed. But I actually think the more interesting sectarian dimension in the region is really Sunni within Sunni. It's Wahhabi against Wahhabi. It's the Wahhabism of the monarchy in Saudi Arabia and the Wahhabist versions or interpretations of Islam as practiced by Al-Qaeda and ISIS. I think we're not looking, that we kind of simplistically at this distance kind of categorize it as Sunni versus Shia, when the deepest tension is among the Sunnis themselves, and the derivatives of the most conservative brand of Islam. People who look at its purity and define it in very different ways, define what a good or just government would be in different ways, and how they'd use the resources. But secondly, I think that when we talk about sectarianism, we're really talking about identity issues. And for me, the thing that's happened so much in the 5 years since the Arab Spring, as these societies face, whether it's a failed state, a fragmented state, a deteriorating state, a war-torn state, is that the kind of national identity, frail that as it was in many cases going in, we're talking about Sykes-Picot just being 100 years old this year, that the sources of identity deteriorated, were eroded, and that people started looking for what are the more primordial sources of identity. It's a little bit like a tornado. What happens when there's a tornado? People go to the basement and they cling to the pillars. And that's the same thing that happens when you have the kind of political upheaval we've seen across the region. People, when there's nothing above ground, they go to their sources of identity in their souls and the things that are age old, and they define what they want next or who their allies are or whatever through those sources of identity. Religion is a big one, but it's not the only one. And I think that we do a great injustice in just throwing out this idea of sectarianism as the thing that kind of defines the divide. I think it's very much the other factors. And when you look at how the region is disintegrating, particularly in the war-torn areas where the state is the frailest or has failed the most, that there is that tribalism is just as much a factor as religious identity. Clan, who's in your neighborhood, your work community. Remember, many families inherit a trade. It descends through the layers, or people in a neighborhood, their families have lived there for decades, maybe even centuries. That there are other sources that too often fall under this category of sectarianism, and it plays out in sectarian terms partly. But I think it's actually something much bigger, and it's reflected in when you look at a map. I did a map for a very controversial map for the New York Times Sunday section 3 years ago, looking at after a year of talking to people in the region, what do you think your region is going to look like in 10 years or 20 years, a generation from now? And in almost every country, there were people who, or the big conflict countries, the big transition countries, there were people who looked at different kinds of borders. And when you look at that now, and a lot of it's already happened, it is as much ethnic identity, it is as much tribe, it is as much historic divisions, geographic divisions that have resurfaced. And that's the kind of thing that we ought to be paying more attention to when we look at what are the sources of political legitimacy down the road. It's not just that someone's Shiite or Sunni, it's a whole basket of sources of identity that will help us understand what is legitimate in looking forward, what is the basis for a social compact in the future, and help us understand the nature of this conflict, which I think we've kind of simplified. Now, diffusing these passions, and I'll close with this, is, I think, going to be much more difficult than solving the traditional conflicts over territory. The Arab-Israeli conflict, as long as that has been drawn out, I think will look much simpler than diffusing these passions that are much deeper. Because there is, it intersects in some degrees with economic issues and political rights, but it's very much that everyone wants to have a little bit more than the next guy to make sure that he can protect what he has. And whether it's, Sunni Alawite in Syria or Kurd Sunnis and Shiites in Iraq, that they have to feel a sense of security, and security not just in what's in a constitution, because they all know that a constitution is only worth the paper it's written on and not much more. That they want to make sure that these things that have given them sustenance during this awful, awkward, violent transition are protected. And that's, I think, what we're going to be dealing with far more than these issues of Bashar Assad versus the opposition as we go forward.
Okay, thank you very much. Paul, you are supposed to pull it all together by talking about political movements.
I will fail miserably. But I'm very happy to be here. Thanks for coming. It's tough to follow such excellent panelists, but maybe it's easy because I think we're covering a lot of common ground. I know it says in the brochure that I'm talking about Islamism, but I'm not. I'm talking about politics and political trends after the Arab winter. I'll touch a bit on Islamism, but also on sort of statism or state nationalism, on quietism, sort of pulling away from politics, and a bit what's left of the pro-democracy activism or pro-democracy movement. And I'll preface by saying, yes, we're talking about the Arab world, but obviously all politics is local, and the story of Morocco is profoundly different than the story of Tunisia or the story of Lebanon or the story of Syria. So maybe these generalizations can't really be made at this level, but we're trying to make some overall reflections. First of all, a few thoughts on politics and governance. This panel is supposed to be about the makeup of post-Arab Spring politics and its connection to governance. And I think it's interesting just to stop a bit at those terms. And I would say that 2011 to 2013 was a moment of politics, but that moment has now been largely closed down or eclipsed. Politics in the sense of people feeling empowered, feeling engaged, either through demonstrations or through elections, a space opening up one way or another for that politics to take place. But I think in some retrospect, we find that the states were not ready to allow politics, and where they were able to reclaim that space, they have done so. A number of the Islamist parties weren't ready to win politics and be in charge of governance, which is the link between politics and governance, and found themselves finally winners in politics but not able to hold on to it. And the vanguard of these uprisings, which really was generally the vanguard, much of it the young, sort of, I would generally cast as pro-democracy people, were not ready for politics. They were ready for public expression, for mass demonstrations, but the nuts and bolts of politics, which is organizing, networking, going for elections, and preparing for real politics, is something they will tell you in retrospect they were not ready for. So already I think we're in for now, a post-political period. How long will this last? As Amy said, when will the next sort of either uprising, explosion, or expression of big politics or mass politics, when will that happen? And where will the states be at that point? Where will the Islamic parties be? Where will the nationalist or pro-democracy movements and programs be? Secondly, what the connection between politics and governance. Obviously, sort of the assumption in the early part of the Arab uprisings is there's a problem with governance, we enter through politics, and through politics we change the governance. The governments that have hit back have sort of reversed the formula and given people a choice between governance and politics that will either give you governance, some modicum of stability and security and some kind of promise of economic progress, or if you want politics, quote unquote, they point to either the collapses in Syria, Libya, and elsewhere, or they point to the poor governance in countries like Lebanon or Iraq, who are rickety electoral systems that are clearly not functioning in terms of governance. And so that relationship between politics and governance has also been turned on its head. So I think we've seen sort of the rise and the demise of politics for now, and that this moment has passed, with states now saying you have to choose between the two. Even Assad in Syria is offering a kind of a Hobbesian social contract that, I am the Leviathan and I am very powerful, and what I offer to you is either submit, and if you submit, you get stability and peace and so on, or we're at a war, we're in a condition of war against, of all against all. That is kind of a, it's a contract of sorts. It was the old Hobbesian contract, and it's one that a lot of these authoritarian regimes don't have far from their mind. I think the Egyptian approach is different, sort of like the Chinese model. You want governance, then you accept sort of the absence of politics, and that if you want this large country, like they say in China, to remain stable and not fall into failed state, like our neighbors in Libya and Syria and so on, you have to accept this type of politics or the absence of politics, and there is a promise of some kind of delivery at the level of governance. I want to make a few remarks about three trends: Islamism, state nationalists, and pro-democracy movements. Those terms obviously are very, very wide in the sense that they include a wide array of very, very different players, but just sort of as labels. First of all, on the Islamist or political Islamists, I would say the last 4 or 5 years were the best of times, and they were the worst of times. Best of times, the Muslim Brotherhood, the mother of the political Islamist movements, won parliamentary and presidential elections in the biggest Arab country and governed. At the same time, they suffered, in a sense, their biggest public and state-induced defeat in essentially their long history, and they find themselves now very much on the margins, as it were, of life in Egypt. But so it was the heyday as well as the lowest point. So they won big in 2012 and lost big in 2013. Part of that loss maybe was poor leadership, bad decisions, and so on, which I think if you compare the Egyptian experience to the Tunisian one, I think leadership and decisions had a lot to do with it. But also there was a sizable public backlash and a split in the sort of revolutionary coalition which had existed in 2011 and 2012. So there was a pushback that perhaps they didn't expect, having ridden a wave of popular unrest to remove a dictator. They were the replacement. I don't think they expected this amount of public backlash in Tunisia or in Egypt, and perhaps weren't ready to deal with it. Obviously, there was also a backlash from the deep state in Egypt. Either that possibly may have been inevitable, but it also could have been the result of certain decisions and things that happened. On the regional level, they suffered a massive backlash from the GCC countries, or some of the GCC countries, who otherwise you might say are very conservative, might have been at some level comfortable with that, but for various reasons, a huge regional backlash from the main or some of the main GCC countries. So a very low point right now for what you might call the establishment political Islamist, the Muslim Brotherhood. And a year or two later, you have the rise of the biggest radical Islamic state in history, or in modern history at least, which is ISIS. And the effects of that, I think, are still reverberating in the world of the whole spectrum of political Islamists, but also among others. And I don't think we have calculated sort of the effects of it beyond the fact, as Shadi said, we sort of focus on which town do they control. Are they in Ramadi? Have they left Ramadi? Are they in Palmyra? Have they left Palmyra? But the fact that sort of the Tea Party of the Muslim Brotherhood has seized the moment. And the Muslim Brotherhood are left sort of like the Jeb Bush of the political Islam. They're like, but we were the Islamists. And this group has taken this idea to such a radical extreme, obviously an extremely violent extreme as well, but as I think Amy said, also a kind of a pure translation and a response to the abolition of the caliphate in 1924 and all of that. That some might say, oh, well, that means that political Islam is very powerful now because, look, they occupy half of Syria and Iraq, and they have branches in Yemen and Libya, and they're fighting in the northern Sinai and so on. Yes, that is certainly true in terms of a proto-state and a fighting force and a power, but I also think that has damaged to a large degree because it's emphasized the extreme nature of what might be taken for political Islam. It has made it much more difficult for the moderates in political Islam or the establishment political Islam to make the case, either to convince secularists and others that they're okay and that they can govern, or to convince real or the hardline political Islamists that they're they're the ones to turn to. So I think it's a very interesting moment, and the effects of the rise of ISIS as a model, as Shadi was saying, as an example, how that will resonate moving forward is important to look at. I would say, however, that far and away, and in all public opinion polls, the public reaction to ISIS is overwhelmingly horrified and negative and so on. So you'd have to say, if anything, they're a very, very bad advertisement for anything linked to that brand, which under the Muslim Brotherhood and the previous iteration of Recep Tayyip Erdogan seemed to be sort of the Christian Democrats of the Arab world. So I think in terms of sort of where Islamism, and obviously we're, summarizing between the experience of the PJD in Morocco, which is quite, functioning reasonably well, to ISIS, it's not the same thing. But I would say militant Islam has proven to be very effective in civil wars, but very ineffective or not popular in societies or states that are not in civil war. Either that's because, as Robin sort of put it in a very evocative metaphor, that when there's a tornado, you cling to whatever is sort of the most essential. But I think militant Islam, both Shiite and Sunni, has proved the most dominant force when you're in a civil war, but not very dominant in terms of being able to be a majoritarian movement in a stable state or a stable society. Political Islam within those societies that are more or less stable, or at least are not in full failed state or civil war, are definitely, Muslim Brothers is on the back foot. How to deal with what happened in Egypt, how to deal with the public backlash that happened, how to deal with ISIS, how to position themselves. The two positive experiences are the one I mentioned, the PJD in Morocco, where they're in power and sharing power with a monarchy, which is still very much in power, but at least that's kind of an experience that's moved more or less in a positive direction. And Al-Nahda in Tunisia, which is coexisting with secular groups and was a player in drafting the wonderful constitution that Robin talked about. Most everywhere else, there really isn't a political process to speak of to say, well, how are the Muslim Brotherhood doing and how are other parties doing? Will the Muslim Brotherhood find a way back to politics in Egypt? That obviously depends, first of all, on Egypt and the Egyptian state. Currently, there is no space for anybody to be involved in any real politics in Egypt. It might also have to do a bit with regional relations, the future of Egyptian-Turkish relations. The Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt has a lot of contacts with Turkey. There could be things that relate to Saudi policy, Turkish policy, Egypt, and so on, which could provide an opening. A few words about the pro-democracy trend. It's not really an organized movement in the sense the Muslim Brotherhood is, but we saw a huge tip of an iceberg come out on the streets in 2011. And if you look at opinion polls and you look at online life, and the Arab world has the highest levels, or among the highest levels of penetration online of any society. So you can sort of track what people are thinking online. And in a snapshot, one would have to say, the values we associate with sort of the wishes for a democratic system, accountable government, elected government, an inclusive society, more or less liberal values, those choices at an individual level, I would have to say, are a majoritarian set of choices, particularly among the young. And you can see that in surveys and on online and so on. And that's important to keep in mind, that while this wave was defeated, partly because it was not ready to win in politics, partly because the states are much harsher than, nice activists can be, but partly because it's a generational wave, and that generation is not in power. The power is still with older generations and older institutions and older ways of thinking, whether the caliphate or a Nasserite-style government. But it's important to note that this remains, I think, and will continue to be sort of a majoritarian preference, that this force of pushing in that direction is a very significant force in the medium and long term. It's not going to go away. And it might take yet another generation to see this translated into actual change. So part of it is generational, but part of it, I would say, is organizational. And a lot of the sort of pro-democracy movements that you visit today in Cairo or Tunisia and so on, those who haven't sort of left the political scene or not in jail or didn't emigrate or not doing other things, they are assessing their own experience and what they've learned and what they were good at and what they weren't good at, and looking for ways how to move forward in terms of organization and how to face challenges in the years ahead. They weren't able to win elections. They were not able to resist a resurgent state. And certainly in countries that descended into civil war, it was immediately the sectarian or the religious militias that took over. But I would say that a brave minority is still fighting on, and you still see this type of activism erupt here and again. This past summer, you saw it even in Iraq, big demonstrations in Baghdad. You saw it in Beirut, demonstrations against the governments there. The last category I'll mention a few things about is, I'll loosely term, statism or state nationalism or even status quo-ism. And in a way, I think the aspirations of 2011, the political aspirations for many people, have been replaced by, as some of my colleagues have said, existential fears. And hence, the governments are no better and in most cases are worse than they were 5 years ago, but the bar has been moved as to why you would put up with a ruler. From the initial bar that was being raised that he should be or she should be democratically elected, accountable, not corrupt, and so on and so forth, to, are they keeping my state together? Are we not descending into civil war? Are we not like Syria and Libya? Are we able to go to work and send our kids to school? The bar has been lowered so much that in a way, I wouldn't say it's a new social contract or a new legitimacy, but in a way it is. And part of that is simple sort of rallying around the flag. Like we take the case of Jordan, where there was a lot of demand to reform and so on in the early period, but Jordanians now look around to Syria, to Libya, and they say, well, you know, the king is good enough and we have a society and country, let's just go with it. But in other cases, and I would say Egypt is an interesting case, there was an element of nationalism that was evoked, putting the army aside and Sisi aside and all of that, to counter the Islamism as a narrative. Who is a citizen? What is social equality? And that had a lot to do with what's the place of women? What's the place of minorities? Is it a civic secular state or is it an Islamic state? And you see some revival of nationalism as a way to define society and how it should be constructed in the face of a powerful ideology like Islamism. So I'll more or less stop there. If one wanted to make a few comments about the future, I think the immediate future has very little politics in it. I think the concerns of states and societies are existential. Recent surveys point to the main concern of citizens around the world is ISIS, according to what they report, stability and all of that, and the states are taking advantage of that. So I think it'll be a good while before politics come back. Unfortunately, I agree with Amy. I don't think any of the states are preparing for that day, because that day will come, and the public, sooner or later, as it did in 2011, is going to demand a role. And I fear that we're going to face it head on with carnage or damage as we had in 2012 and 2013. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much to all of you. Before I open it to the public, I just want to, to ask a question of all of you, and then we'll start taking questions from the floor. Keep in mind that I'm also taking questions, and these are all these pieces of papers I'm getting from the overflow room. There are 50 people sitting in a different room, and they are sending their questions here. So sometimes I'll ignore you because I have to also look at recognize the pieces of paper. My question to you all is this. In 2011, we all indulged, and I mean the people in the Arab countries, analysts outside, in a moment of unjustified hope. And when I mean unjustified hope is particularly for those of us who have been studying political change, who have been studying upheaval, who have been studying revolutions, who have been studying democratic transformation, we know that they always fail the first time around. And if they don't, that they are long processes, they are not very, they don't happen all at once, essentially. Huntington talks about waves of democracy, which is, it's one thing I agree with with him, that in fact, countries attempt a transformation which usually don't succeed, and then they come, and years later it comes again, because something has been left behind. That's the idea. And so the question that I like to ask of all of you, what do you think this upheaval of the last 5 years have left behind in different countries that might in the end become the basis for further change? Because if you just look at the situation as it is now, there is not much to be hopeful about. But yet nothing, people talked a few years ago, people talked about the end of fear. Fear has not ended. I mean, even in a country like Egypt, you just look at what was supposed to be the fifth celebration of the Tahrir uprising, and nobody turned out. People were afraid to turn out, and with very good reasons. I mean, but that does not mean that nothing has been left behind. One thing that to me has been a change, and unfortunately it's not a change for the better, is the end of complacency on the part of governments. Governments do not take their citizens for granted in the Arab world. I remember a conversation in 2010 with a high-ranking member of the policy committee of the National Democratic Party in Egypt, and we were talking about the possible succession of Gamal Mubarak, Hosni Mubarak's attempt to install his son. And he was dismissing the opposition. Essentially, he said, the Egyptian people are docile. And if they try not to be docile, the army will take care of them. Nobody would say that today. I mean, and not only in Egypt, but I think in no other countries. It's not necessarily a good thing, because governments react to the fact that they don't longer perceive their people as docile by being very repressive, of course. I think Sisi is much more repressive than Mubarak was at the end, because he does not perceive his people as being docile. But, so the question that this is one answer I have, but the question that I'd like to put to all of you, and I want short answers so that we can go on to, what has been left? What is different now than it was? And I'll start with you, Shadi.
Sure. So look, I don't think that we were wrong to be cautiously hopeful 5 years ago. I don't think that the way it turned out was inevitable. I mean, now when we look back with the benefit of hindsight, it almost seems like it couldn't be any other way. But I don't think there had to be a coup in Egypt. I don't think that Syria had to be this way. I won't get into what we could have done differently. It's a different conversation. But I think that one thing we really have to keep in mind, and it really hasn't come up much so far, is that I think one of the lessons of the Arab Spring, and I'm in the minority on this, is that indigenous actors aren't enough. I mean, we heard in 2011 as Americans, this isn't about us, it's about them. I actually think it's partly about us as Americans, in the sense that in each of the revolutions, failed or otherwise, with the exception of Tunisia, each one outside actors play an important or even a decisive role. And we can go one by one and look at that. Syria, Libya, Yemen are the obvious cases of this. Certainly Bahrain, Egypt, there was an important international factor as well, especially in terms of sustaining the military coup. So I think that in one sense it didn't have to be this way, because the U.S. and the international community didn't have to be so incredibly pathetic when it came to its role in supporting, or I should say not supporting, the Arab Spring.
Marina always asks the best and the hardest questions. Well, I'll just put forward one idea, and I think it's Tunisia, actually. And Tunisia is very shaky. The democratic experiment there may fail. Many do, and Tunisia has as many things going against it as it has going for it in terms of its democratic prospects. And I'm aware that Tunisia is an outlier in the Arab world. It's a very unusual set of circumstances. It's not a country that is going to shape and drive the future of the region. Yet, in this region, with all the arguments that were made for so long that democratic systems, democratic transitions could never happen in this part of the world, that people don't want democracy, that it's not possible, that there's something culturally or even genetically about Arabs that makes democracy impossible, Tunisia disproves that. And although the situation there is very shaky, the democratic transition is very shaky, it is a real, genuine attempt to build a democratic system that is taking place there with all its faults and flaws. And to me, this is a tiny, tiny beachhead of a different future for the region that at least shows that it's possible. And Tunisians are basically doing it themselves, which I think is actually very, very important. So thank you.
I think there are four things that contributed to the Arab Spring, and they're still there. And the first is the fact that for the first time you have the majority of the population across the region, with the exception of Yemen, the majority of people are literate, and that includes females. And that has contributed to a sense of beyond a neighborhood, beyond a village, beyond a town, beyond even a country. They have a wider sense of the world and the movement toward rights in other parts of the world. They're very aware of whether it's the demise of apartheid and minority rule in Africa, the end of military dictatorships in Latin America, the demise of communism in Eastern Europe. There's a sense that they're part of something bigger, and I think that's still very much there. Secondly, there is a sense of diversity that had not been there before. And it's a function, just one anecdote. 20 years ago this year, Al Jazeera was born. It was the first satellite television station that in the local language that circumvented state control of the media and provided a sense of what was news in the region. Today we have over 500 independent satellite television stations in the Arab world, and they have different clerics and different news programs and different talk shows and different soap operas and so forth. There is that the sense of diversity among the young, which is educated, that intersects with that and gives them a sense that there is no single truth, there's no single way, that diversity is integrated in the way they think. The third fact is the mere demographics, and the fact that not only are they this generation literate and has a greater sense of political patterns, but that they are also the majority in virtually every country. I think the median age is 18 in Yemen and 26 in Saudi Arabia, that across the board, the majority that will determine the future are all young. And the fourth thing I think that's a mix of all those three is, one, a sense of expectations. They may not know how to do it, but I think there's also an awareness today left behind that they need to do more homework, that they knew how to protest against something, they didn't know how to create an alternative, and that there's a sense of there's a lot of homework to do. And I think they haven't figured it out yet. And I think the tragedy is that in the absence of whether it's the political parties, the agenda, the resources, the networks, that ISIS is attractive. I mean, in Tunisia, you've had the best case scenario has contributed the largest share of foreign fighters to ISIS, 5,000 and counting, and another 9,000 have been prevented from leaving the country. So that that when there is an alternative idea, there's an attraction to that. But I think that that's when the disillusionment sets in. And the good thing about, or the good bad thing about ISIS is that it can't deliver, and that there is this reaction against it because of its brutality, because of the narrowness of the human experience, and the fact that people do know they deserve more, they have rights, they have a sense of their place in the world. So I think all those things that contributed are still there, and that's the thing that gives me hope long term.
Yeah, I would say, I mean, what we've witnessed is a historical power shift from states which were somewhat omnipotent to over a population. If you go back 40, 50, 60 years, just the literacy, the rural nature of things, the lack of access to information, absence of empowerment. So what we're seeing is the result of a power shift that's going only in one direction over historical time. And this was the first sort of wave of it, the first eruption. This is also the first citizen rights revolution uprising in Arab history. Other things in the 50s were about Israel or about colonialism. So this is the beginning of a process of empowerment that happened in Europe, centuries ago, or partly in the 19th century. This is only going in one direction. But I think where we are in this moment is that this sort of monster that's positive, in a positive sense, rears its head, and the powers that be, particularly the states, were able to wrestle it back to the ground. They've sort of built up protections against it in the near term. And that's very unfortunate. I agree with Shadi that particularly in Egypt, it need not have gone this way. These were, I think, errors or decisions that were made. I think the Muslim Brotherhood could have maintained a different direction, include the Revolutionary Coalition, not be at complete loggerheads with the deep state, nor with the GCC. Had only Egypt succeeded, I think Syria would have failed because of the way the Assad regime is. I think Libya would have failed. Tunisia has made it. Egypt could have made it. But sadly, I think it's now decades. It's pushed itself, or it's been pushed decades back. So.
Okay. Thank you very much. And I'm going to open it now over there. And please wait for the microphone and introduce yourselves.
My name is Amin Mahmoud, who's Center of Egyptian-American Relations. And to Shadi, to his last statement, the fascist regime in Egypt really failed to deliver anything in the last 2.5 years, from security to economic and so on. He still continue living by bribe in Europe, giving money to states, and by United States, John Kerry in particular, not even the president, give him promise because of the Israel and the relation. Why at least United States doesn't protect the human rights of one like Aya Higazi, who is American citizen and been detained for months now without trial? Ismail Iskandarani, who came out from this place, was abducted, and nobody do anything. I wish the Wilson Institute can be active more. And like we saw the Italian fellow who was killed in Egypt, in England and in the United States, a lot of academics already send thousands of letters to the government of Egypt to change that. Okay. Thank you.
It was directed to you.
Okay. yeah, right. But in case you wanted to have a couple.
No,
okay.
I'll take a few,
So
a few single questions.
Yeah. So I think your question is a really interesting one. Why doesn't the U.S. seem to care more about human rights or democracy in the Middle East? Look, this administration has very consciously, and I would say somewhat aggressively, deprioritized human rights and democracy. I mean, it's not even anywhere close to the top set of priorities. And there are a number of reasons for that. I mean, one of them, obviously, is the this desire to disassociate from the Bush administration's freedom agenda, which, oddly enough, I mean, Bush was bad in a lot of ways. The one thing that I think he got right, the one positive aspect of his legacy, was precisely his at least rhetorical support for democracy in the Middle East, and actually his more than rhetorical support for a brief period in 2004 and 2005. But I think more generally, I think it gets to this bigger issue of how we see America's role in the world. And again, I mean, I don't think this administration wants to do more. Whenever they face a crisis, the question is, how can we do as little as possible? That is the organizing principle of this administration.
Okay, thank you. There in the center.
Good afternoon. I'm Danguala Barduskaite, the American University. You all have mentioned the lack of alternatives in the Middle East. And from my perspective, it seems that in the Middle East, governments, they are not seeking to educate their own people and to create those alternatives. And do you see any positive examples and maybe like even cooperation with the Western governments, like the United States or any others, that governments are really trying to educate their own people and to create an alternative in the future, because the generation still has to mature and later to take over the government and to produce those alternatives. Thank you.
Who wants to take it? You have been deputized, Paul.
Well, I would say no, the governments in the region, I mean, as relates to, if you separate education, jobs, and so on from what might be political, I think a number of the governments in the region, in the countries where there are now stable governments and so on, are putting forward sort of the Chinese contract or the Gulf contract, which is, we will promise, now often they fail, but we will promise stability and some economic growth and so on and so forth, in exchange for the absence, effectively, of politics. I think what we've lost in the last 5 years was that middle path, which we had seen in countries even like Egypt and so on, which Marina in previous book had called facade democracy. Yes, of course it was a facade democracy, but I think it was possibly a halfway house where there was more freedoms than there are now. There was multi-party, the beginnings of that. Yes, they were not real elections, but it was sort of moving in that direction. And perhaps the regimes at the time felt that this is not dangerous, or at least it's not dangerous to them now in the immediate future. But we are now in a worse place. We are now in countries, particularly the republics, who recognize the danger of even the minimal level of process and political inclusion in gaming, that it will inevitably lead to the overthrow of a republican government. And interestingly, we see more progress in a monarchy like Morocco, more inclusive government and more democratic practices or electoral practices than in republics. So I would think we're in a worse place now, and governments, the republics in particular, are very, very fearful of any even minimal empowerment of their population. Even if they say jobs and education, they hope that will lead in a completely different direction.
You are over here.
Ambassador Sarhan, representing the Chief Representative of Arab League in Washington. Sorry I missed Mr. Shadi Hamid, his remarks, but I got some of Amy remarks. It's very good, but I would like to say something about that. You said, or you mentioned some of the factors about the reason or the cause of the uprising, or what you call it, spring revolution in the Middle East. I think maybe I missed it. I think that's the revolutions in the Middle East is a combination of different factors. I agree with Robin, which he said we need to diffuse the conflict between Israel and Palestine. It's been a long time, and one of the reasons maybe in the street of the Arab at that time of the spring is the frustration. They felt the frustration because this problem has not been solved. Beside what you said about economically, socially, corruption, income inequality, a lot of things. But the question or the issue of Arab-Israeli conflict is a major one. So this is one maybe you have mentioned, but I would like to add that to that factor. Robin, thank you very much about what you said. I would like to come back to you about sectarian. Sectarians, I just noticed, or we Arab noticed, Sunni noticed recently that you've been, not you, I mean, the media focusing and emphasizing on in Sunni. Every now I just heard a lot of things about Sunni. It's just showing to the world that the Sunni are a bad people. Sunni. We haven't heard anything about the other sector. So I wondering why the media or why the press is focusing in this word Sunni. Because I'm a man with a 60 years old, and I come from Saudi Arabia, by the way. At that time, we never heard anything about Sunni or Shia. We never asked about, are you Sunni or Shia? If something never happened. It just something maybe happened after the invasion of Iraq. When these things had happened, I think they incited the things and the division between Shia and Sunni. So Sunni, I don't know why it's being focused on that issue. Other things, Robin, you talked about the unemployment in Saudi Arabia, 38%. Huh?
Can we have one question instead of
Yeah, okay.
four?
I just would like to have the fact. Thank you very much. Okay.
Okay, you have been challenged.
Thank you, Ambassador. I should have added to my list, I have it here in my notes, but I don't think I said it, that in the past, and still to a certain degree now, but especially in the past, defense of Palestinians, Palestinian rights, was one of the claimed sources of legitimacy of every Arab regime to one degree or another. So certainly this is has been part of the legitimacy equation of rulers. And I definitely agree with you, number one, that the conflict needs to be solved. Palestinians need their rights. And number two, that it remains a very important issue to people across the region. However, I think it's very, very interesting that in the initial mass demonstrations and protests in 2011, this issue was almost nowhere to be seen. The young people who went out, mostly young people, who started the demonstrations were not talking about this issue at all. And some of them even were angry at their governments and angry at their leaders for talking about Palestinian rights while failing to give them, their own citizens, their rights. So I'm not sure that this issue, although it remains very important to many people around the world and in the region, I think that the politics have shifted a little bit, and there's a lot of other issues that are also galvanizing people and concentrating their minds.
Very briefly, look, the difference between the sectarian divide between Sunni and Shia. I lived in Beirut for 5 years in the 1980s, and there was a lot of talk about the Sunnis and the Shiites. And as the Shiites emerged as a major power, and the tensions in the civil war, so it predates Iraq, but Iraq clearly accelerated the process. And I actually think a lot of the sectarian divide today is less about difference in dogma and doctrine as much as it is a political rivalry, a pride of place in the region. It's a lot about power. And it has, to a certain degree, something to do with the United States. There is, in the tension between Iran and Saudi Arabia, Iran was one of the two pillars of U.S. policy until 1979 and its revolution. And after 1979, Saudi Arabia, more important now because the price of oil rose in the 70s, and Egypt, in an aftermath of its peace with Israel, suddenly gained pride of place, and they filled that vacuum. And now that you have an Iran nuclear deal, there's a sense, I think, within in Saudi Arabia and in other Gulf sheikdoms that that the Iranians may be making a comeback, and there's a lot of nervousness about that. And so a lot of the tension we see play out in the region in other places, whether it's a proxy conflict in Syria or because they have rival allies in other countries, plays out in part over kind of regional influence, pride of place, and pride of relationship with the United States, which is more important. And so I think that when it was a point I meant to make and I forgot all about it, sorry. But I think when you look at this basic question that it's not, when it comes to Sunni, it's the Sunni because of the diversity within the Sunni world, wider than it's ever been. When you look at the tensions between Saudi Arabia and Al-Qaeda and ISIS, all claim to be in some form Wahhabi or descendants of Wahhabism. And they all feel they're more just. So in some ways, the focus on the Sunni branch of the faith is because of this new diversity and trying to sort out the rivalry and what it means. That's why I thought it was something different than just to talk about Sunni and Shiite, which is something we all know about.
Thank you very much. I'm going to, we don't have much time. I'm going to take one question from the overflow room and two questions from here, and then you can deal with them as you want. Okay, this is an interesting question that we got from the overflow room from a gentleman, since he puts down his name, who believes that the panel was in some ways attempting to legitimize ISIS. That you were talking about ISIS in the context of legitimacy, essentially. And the question is whether you really have thought clearly what are the consequences of trying to legitimize ISIS. So this is one question. And I'll take two more from here. I had seen over there, yes, and then over here.
My name is Phil Carretta, and I'm a retiree from the State Department. When Mohamed Bouazizi launched the revolution in Tunisia, he wanted to get a permit to sell fruits and vegetables. He wasn't interested in launching a newspaper or anything. He wanted economic freedom. He wasn't interested in political freedom. Do you see any moves in the region to expand political freedom, to consolidate, expand economic freedom to consolidate stability in the region? Or has that been overlooked?
I would say, I mean, Bouazizi, wouldn't put it as economic freedom as much as economic opportunity. I mean, the revolutions, one of their main slogans, is dignity, food, bread, jobs, things of that nature. And when you look at, the unemployment and the situation, which we might add has only gotten extremely worse in the last 5 years, young people and large swaths of the population just need economic goods. They need jobs, they need food, they need housing, they need the very basics. That is something that some of the governments, like the government in Egypt and others, are saying, we'll promise you those things. It's not freedom. We'll promise you that in exchange for the absence of political freedom. That is sort of the way the GCC kind of works, the way China, Singapore, and others. But, if you take a country like Egypt, unless Egypt is able to drastically reform its public administration, the business environment, and so on, it cannot achieve the levels of growth that Turkey achieved in the past decade, or that some of the Asian tigers achieved. But I think many of the governments have correctly identified that for a lot of people, it's the economy, stupid, as the Clinton slogan said.
Yeah. I realized, I'll come back to you, I realized that I did not take the third question that I had the promise. So can we have the gentleman back there?
Over here?
Which gentleman is the confusion?
Yeah. He knows.
Ege Partal, Society DC. I had a similar question about the economy, but more of a, what is the legacy of Arab Spring on the economies, and seeing the short-term fall of oil prices and the long-term lack of infrastructure, especially like in the war regions? Do you think the status quo of the state can be sustained with the current economic situation?
Okay, thank you. We have three questions on the table, and let's start here. If you can also make your final comments. Okay. Keep in mind that you are keeping people from their coffee.
Oh,
okay.
Okay. Well, look, I think there's been too much agreement on this panel, so I'm going to just take issue with something Paul said a little bit, if you don't mind. But so look, I think that one of the interesting things is that we thought that economic issues were going to be more of a driver, that this would be it would become a primary cleavage in Arab societies. What we actually find out is that in no country did economic issues become really a major issue in electoral campaigns or in distinguishing between one party or another. And the main cleavage became ideology or religion, the Islamist secular divide. Now, that doesn't mean the economy doesn't matter, but it means that pretty much everyone agrees on this vaguely like left of center. The free market is good when it's good. Social justice is good when it's good. We all kind of agree. And this is where I think parties like Ennahda they try to focus on economic issues, but it turns out everyone sort of agrees on the broad outlines. On this legitimization of ISIS question, which is actually a really interesting question. That would be a perception someone would have after listening to us. I wouldn't call it legitimizing ISIS. I would say I take ISIS very seriously. I think that they're a very dangerous and frightening enemy, and I think that they're actually more frightening because they're serious. They're actually offering something that we shouldn't dismiss. And I get concerned sometimes when people say, well, they're just a bunch of thugs and fanatics, and they're just kind of retroactively using religion, and they're just actually a bunch of Ba'athists. I don't think the evidence supports that. So I think that the only way to seriously confront and defeat ISIS is to really understand what they stand for and what they're offering. I think that's actually one issue I have with the Obama administration, this kind of dismissive attitude towards them, but also this almost this sense that if the arc of history bends towards justice, groups like ISIS will naturally burn themselves out. I actually don't think that they will naturally burn themselves out.
Thank you. So I do not believe that ISIS is legitimate. I think it is a horrible, vile phenomenon, movement, institution, what have you. But I do think that when we look at the forms of political legitimacy that are being put forward in the region by different actors after the Arab uprisings, this is one. And it is a fringe movement. It has actually not attracted mass public support, and most people in the region oppose it. But yet it has attracted some people, especially young people. So there is something about its claims of authority and what it is promising to give to people and to do that for some people in the Arab world does have a form of legitimacy. So I agree with Shadi. I think we have to take it seriously as one extreme fringe movement that luckily does not have mass appeal, but it has some appeal among the margins of society in many cases. With regard to the economy, I mean, first of all, Mohamed Bouazizi, the myth-making of Mohamed Bouazizi, he's not here, as we know, to speak for himself about why he set himself on fire, but I don't think it was just entirely about having a job, not having a job, or wanting to make more money, and not just be living in the informal economy, which is about now 40 to 50% of the Tunisian economy. There's a lot of Mohamed Bouazizis in Tunisia. He stood for something that was about demanding dignity. It wasn't just about employment. And so I think that we would be ill-served if we understood economic and social demands in the region, especially by young people, as just about having a job. It's about more than that. It's about living a life of dignity where you can feel a sense of accomplishment, you can feel pride in yourself that you're a good member of society, that you have your education, you can get a good job that can feed your family, that you can have enough money to get married. It's not just about finding a job, it's about more than that. And it's that intangible sense, I think, of dignity that so many Arab leaders don't understand and are failing to figure out how to create a system that will provide this to their citizens.
I actually think economics is a huge driver, will continue to be, and it may well be that the next round of protests and the next generation of leaders come from the labor movement. I think we've seen that already in Tunisia. In the absence of alternatives, this is the one place you do find organization. You find some experience. You find some alternative leaders. I think when you look at the change that's to come, I mean, I think ISIS is even facing an economic challenge. The Treasury Department yesterday said that their intelligence indicates that ISIS has had to cut its pay to to its fighting force by half. We know that whether it's their oil tankers, their oil business, the fact that the U.S. bombs have hit their banks. We saw pictures of dollar bills or dollars, floating through the skies when they were hit. That's a question it may have to face. I think that the change we see elsewhere, whether it's the challenges of the price of oil and what that's going to affect not only in the oil-producing countries but also in the aid that they can provide elsewhere. A lot of these countries that are struggling to develop, they can attract foreign investment because of whether it's the instability, the Russian plane shot down in Egypt, and of course the activities in the Sinai. I mean, across the region, you've got ISIS has, I think, 19 branches now. Libya is a virtual colony that they turn then to those countries that might give them aid, and those countries don't have the resources that they once did. So I think that the economy is actually going to define the political trends and the forces and the activism probably within the next 5 to 10 years.
Okay.
Yeah, I just want to, I agree that I think economy was and is a very, very important component. None of us are saying it's just the economy and they were just, militating for that. But I think, one of the failures of the uprising or of the politics of it is sort of, as Shadi said, it was all about politics at the end, whereas there is and was a very serious economic challenges. And yet the parties, the narratives and so on, none of them had a very viable economic model to put forward to get people out of the situation they're in. If you look at the politics in Turkey a decade or two ago, or the leadership in East Asia, which was able to move people from one economic condition to another, we didn't have that neither in the leaders or the parties or the groups that were engaged. Currently, some of the governments, even if they want to institute serious change, the trade-offs are so costly and difficult in terms of the public sector and in terms of what it would cost to transform public sectors and sort of economies they inherited from the 50s and 60s to one that is really competitive and really can create opportunities for massive investment and growth. The politics are not there to sell it to the people and to get those trade-offs as it was done in Turkey and East Asia, and that remains a major problem moving forward. The question that was asked, what's sort of the situation 5 years later in terms of the economies, there are some negative generally when you're looking at like Egypt and others. Partly, obviously, it's simply instability in terms of the situation, lack of confidence for investors and so on. That remains the case. Investment regimes and business environments for Egypt and others which remain very, very complex, high levels of corruption, slow judiciary. Nothing has been transformed in a major way to encourage massive investment. Tourism has been hit big time intentionally by terrorist groups or others. In Tunisia we see, and in Egypt we see. So quite low. On the other hand, I think with low oil prices, it hurts the Gulf countries, but I think for oil importing countries, it reduces their bill and gives them a little bit of breathing space. So that at least for countries maybe like Egypt is not all negative.
Thank you very much. Okay, we are going to take a break that was supposed to be 15 minutes. We have eaten part of your coffee break, and then we reconvene for the next panel. And please help me thank the
Thanks so much. Enjoyed
Thank you
it.
very much.
Thank you.
I forgot to turn my phone off.
You gonna say it too?
Do a lunch or something.
Yeah, we should. Yeah.
Chat.